Hey everyone, so today what I'm going to be doing is giving you feedback on your overcrowding investigative report. If you have questions at the end, you can always comment on this page or talk to me after spring break or before. So what I'm really going to be focusing on are the strengths of this paper and then areas that need to be improved so that if you are interested in taking this paper somewhere else, you know what you need to do, but also so that you can contextualize why you received the grade that you received. So, you were interested in overcrowding or overcrowded classrooms and the impact that the overcrowded classrooms have on SLPs. So there were 4 points given depending on how clear your investigative question is, and also that it in fact is something that's worth investigating. So your actual question is definitely worth investigating. Having now spoken to a couple of SLPs, I now know that it is something that is new. So it's not just that I don't know about SLPs and that's why I think it's very new and interesting. It, in fact, is a conversation that does need to happen. So that's great. For me, though, what was, I think, a little confusing is the starting point of your report. And I know we talked about this during the conferences, and you mentioned that you were going to start with the roles and responsibilities. But having now read the whole thing from beginning to end, I think your real interest is on how SLPs are being asked to do so much more than ever before, and there's so much more overcrowding in classrooms than ever before. Um, or even if there's not more overcrowding than ever before, the fact that there is overcrowding makes these new demands impossible. So, having said all that, you start with the roles and responsibilities of school based speech language pathologists have changed dramatically as a result of multiple modifications in school policies. I, in fact, think that the stronger lead is hidden on the next page. SLPs now not only have to address articulation and fluency issues, but support students that, because of language or communication disorders, are failing academically. Some of the added areas SLPs have to work with struggling students are literacy, math, and learning processes in general. However, existing factors such as overcrowded classrooms are more than an obstacle at the time of delivering speech speech and language services. So a combination of these two bullet points I think would make a stronger lead and be um, more related to what you're actually talking about. So that's, I think, the most significant difference between a report and a research paper. I think what you were trying to do by talking in very general terms about idea and the roles and responsibilities is give us a general introduction into your topic. But for an investigative report, that's not necessary, nor is it wise, because it misleads your reader into thinking that this is going to be what the entire report is about, when in fact it's not. So we clarified that the lead should really be modified. The other thing, which should not be surprising, that I'm still stuck on, and I know I sound like a broken record, but um, when you talk about the workload, okay, so let's just go bullet by bullet. An overcrowded classroom affects the quality in speech pathology services given to children. Due to an astounding caseload, the workload seems impossible to meet the IDEA NSCLB or NCLB and IEP standards. Okay, for me, what was very confusing is this difference between caseload and workload. Are you saying that because they have so many cases, they have so much work, or they are unable to meet all of the demands of each individual case? um, because these two words can be used interchangeably, so I just wanted some clarification, and that's very minor, but because it's, such a long report and it's used so often, that can become a problem. And then the next bullet point we have many children in overcrowded schools do not receive the SLP services due to the lack of speech therapists based in the schools or the overwhelming caseloads. According to the National Institute on Communication Disorders, 1 out of every 15 children has a speaking disorder. The increasing number of students with an IEP to the SLP ratio has proven to be an overwhelming task for the Department of Education. Okay, so I understand that I need to know about these standards in order to understand how an SLP's workload is just impossible. I totally get that. And in fact, I get that so much that I wonder if this should come maybe earlier on or come with the bit about the changing roles and responsibilities, if that should be combined with this part. But what's confusing to me is in this passage, I'm not really sure what the point of this paragraph is. It seems like you go from talking about caseloads to overcrowded schools to speaking disorders and how many students have speaking disorders. Um, and then talking about, in general terms, how the increasing number of students with an IEP has become a problem for the DOE. So for me, what really needs to happen is a very and these two are actually, I think, coming from the same paragraph. But I think because this is unclear, then this I'm also unclear of. But I also wonder if this just needs um, better transitions from sentence to sentence, and also a clearer topic sentence. I wonder if what you're trying to say is SLP services are impacted by overcrowding because overcrowding in schools is not just overcrowding of general population, it also means that there's an increased amount of students with an IEP. That's like point number one. And then point number two, which I think should be really in a separate paragraph, is along with overcrowding comes these new standards that also create more work for the SLPs. Now, for me, what I really wished was uh, either organized better or maybe eliminated is there's two lines of investigations going on here. One, how there's been a sudden change in standards and that has impacted SLPs. But two, how there's also now, or just in general, how having more people in schools means more work for SLPs and how that more work for SLPs impacts the quality of SLP services. While those two things might seem like very similar ideas, they in fact are significantly different, and therefore I would figure out a way in which you can present that information from the beginning of the report. So presenting the information that of overcrowding and of these changing responsibilities together, or maybe, and this is what I'm more inclined to believe, maybe it is that you're interested in how SLP roles and responsibilities have been um, affected by IDEA, No Child Left Behind, and just like the standardization of DOE, how that has impacted SLPs. So just something to consider. Then you have this bit about the DOE, and you say over-enrolled synonymous with crowded and overcrowded is the term used in the study in the study to define what occurs when the number of students enrolled in a school facility is larger than the number of students it is designed to accommodate, statistically defined as more than 5%, et cetera, et cetera. So just a point, I do think that there are moments where you're integrating your sources quite well, but there are plenty of moments where I feel like you're giving me huge blocks of quote or huge blocks of text, and you're not really integrating it in between your own discovery and your own explanation. And I think these 2 points are examples of that. In fact, you can see that there's no end quote, so it's not even clear when this quote is supposed to end. And for me here, this is a whole lot of information about this, about overcrowding, and it's not connected to a discovery topic sentence or finished with an explanation in your own words. But aside from that, this comes in the middle of the paper. And I in fact wondered if, and again, this is feedback, but it's also really dependent on where you wanted this paper to go. If your paper is interested in overcrowding, I wondered if this should really come um, way earlier. So you have your lead about SLPs and changing roles and impacted by overcrowding. And then right after, you talk about what overcrowding means in very specific terms. Because I quite like the fact that you talk about this and then you talk about the difference between over-enrolled and just crowded. And there isn't really that big of a difference, and understanding what like dictionary definition of overcrowded means, um, but I think it should really come earlier. Then we have this huge, I think a good chunk of what follows, two and a half pages of just discoveries, and they're all amazing discoveries. Um, you talk about how the caseloads are impacted. Then you talk about, and I love the usage of bullet points. I think that was a very smart move, um, and one that carried over in your presentation. And then you talk about, specifically how caseloads impact quality, which was great. And so another question I had is whether or not this part, actually maybe here to here, should really be where the paper starts. And what precedes all of this should really be condensed and integrated into this part of the paper. So when you're talking about caseloads, a bit about IEPs. When you're talking about caseloads, a little bit about how this is different from how it used to be, a little bit about how SLPs used to not have to do this much. That might have helped. And the other reason for that is um, I felt as though throughout this paper did feel like it was written by four different people. Not to say that, I'm trying to ask you to hide the fact that there are four authors here. There are four authors, and that's great. But there is a way in which you sometimes are repeating information that you're repeating information that needs to be, um, sorry, you're repeating information that, I want to show you an example. Um, so here you have the bit about the IEPs, and then I think I have it here. I don't. But in the beginning, it's sort of where this all comes in about IEP standards and the amount it costs to get your child evaluated, all of that stuff. Um, it's saying the same thing, and so that's another thing. I think that's the most important thing that I wanted you to um, clarify for your own self. Read the whole paper from beginning to end and notice that there are moments that are repeated, um, that can, one, just feel redundant, but also two, mislead your reader into thinking that there are differences when in fact it's the same information. Hopefully that makes sense. Okay. So then we go to another discovery, and I just wanted to know, I thought this way of asking the question was a little awkward. I would rather put it in a sentence. So, you know, how are, how would we put this? Um, we wouldn't start with how because we don't want a question. I think the idea is with and with overcrowding comes the need of using non-traditional spaces. And then you go into the usage of lunchrooms and other facilities that don't necessarily work with work or don't necessarily help students learn because the environment is not great for learning. Like a lunchroom is not necessarily where a student learns best. So I think that is all great, but it needs to be clarified with a stronger discovery statement. And then we have the ending where you're talking about what is being done now. I think this is a really strong lit review paragraph because you really are synthesizing several different bits of information and you're contextualizing it with your own introduction, and then you do quite a bit of explanation. So I think this is a phenomenal paragraph, and it's indicative of the kind of work you would be doing in a literature review. Having said all that, with this paragraph, I also wondered if you should, and I think I've been saying this throughout, if you should bring this in earlier. In other words, what I'm sort of stuck on is what is the overall question that you're asking? Is it, can we help SLPs with the overcrowding problem? Or is it, has overcrowding impacted SLPs? Or is it, how have SLPs been asked to change their responsibilities? And how has that led to problems, more problems? I think you're trying to answer all of these questions, but I wonder if you should really be focusing on one. So if your question is, can we fix the overcrowded problem? Then I think there are ways in which this paragraph could become the whole paper, but each way or each method would be backed up with some bits and pieces from the paragraphs earlier. In other words, teachers should be given an aid according to meter, as the burden would be significantly less on the teacher and the aide salary would improve ratios and reduce cost. So here, this is a discovery, right? You've discovered that this is something, and again, this would be if our question is, how can we resolve the overcrowding problem? This is a discovery, and it would be backed up by your, I think it was the middle part where you're talking about the increase in caseloads and how more and more SLPs are asked to deal with, dozens of students, right? So this would support, that bit of information would support this discovery of the need for an aid. Then there's also a bit about the price it costs to get students evaluated. It came in the idea section. That would also support this, right? So you're talking about how it's really expensive, and then you talk about how this is a solution that's necessary then because it would reduce all of these costs that we've found to be a part of SLP services, or a part of the DOE when SLPs aren't able to do their job effectively. So that's just something, again, that I was considering. Now, if that's not the question you were interested in, then that's totally fine. But I think just to close, or the second to last thing I want to say, um, the strengths here were the wide range of sources, your use of APA, the reference page was perfect, the in-text citations were perfect, and for the most part, I did mention the parts where it wasn't well integrated, but for the most part, I liked the way your sources were always related to the overall question. So in many ways, it wasn't integrated into specific paragraphs, but it was always integrated in the sense that it was trying to answer the specific question of SLPs and overcrowding. The areas, though, that are in need of improvement, and I talked about this already, overall organization, I mentioned all of these different places where I feel like you could have begun, and that's always a sign of it not really being well organized, because there are so many spots where we're like, well, is this the beginning? Is this the beginning? I'm not sure. Clarifying the lead has a lot to do with that. And then also, and again, this is all, it's like a domino effect. It's all related because the organization's a little unclear. The lead becomes confusing, which also means that there's a lot of moments where you're giving me research or you're repeating ideas, and so it becomes like a research paper and not an investigative report. Why is this so important? A research paper is not as urgent as an investigative report, and so those blocks of redundancies or of defining these terms interrupts that urgency, and you don't want that to happen. So hopefully all of that makes sense. Minor grammar thing. Um, you have the sentence, in order to facilitate their success, an individual education plan is developed for students with a disability and planned with goals for the students. Okay, three grammatical things that I want to talk to you about. First is it's way too wordy. Second is this is incorrect use of possessive. Third is when you're starting a sentence with a dependent marker, and that's, a word or a phrase that makes the whole clause dependent, there needs to be a comma. So I've revised, and it should really read, in order to facilitate their success, an IEP with goals is developed. Oh, this should be AN. Sorry, apologies about that. And in fact, let me fix that. Okay. And retake. Okay. In order to facilitate their success, an IEP with goals is developed for students with a disability. So I changed the phrasing a little bit so it's less wordy, but also I added the comma, remember, because this is dependent, and I changed students to be just regular students because this means that it's possessing something and the students are not possessing the with. Now, if you wanted to say is developed for students' heads, maybe, then you would need the possessive because the students possess the heads. Here it's just, it might be a typo, it might not be, but I just wanted to clarify. All right, so now we're officially done going over everything. I didn't talk about the rubric because for the most part, I really feel like everything, um, it was really organization that I wanted to talk to you all about. You did come in and we did talk about your paper. You do have discoveries all throughout this paper. You do integrate different sources in one paragraph, so it's not just a source being summarized in individual paragraphs. And Yep, that's it. So if you have any questions, again, you can comment on this page or you can email me or we'll talk after spring break.